The wind had been rising since noon, pushing drifts against the low rail fence and combing the fields with silver teeth. Elias Carter watched from the porch a long while before going in, his breath fogging the air, his bones murmuring their protest at the cold. Snow came light at first, dust on a tabletop, but the sky was a hard gray lid, and he knew what it promised. Inside, the cabin kept its own company. The fire in the stone hearth was dying, a scatter of red like the last embers of a dream. He bent to it, coaxed a flame from kindling, and the smoke curled up the chimney in slow, reluctant threads. The room smelled of ash and pine and something older time, maybe. His wife's rocking chair sat in the corner, empty now 8 winters, but he had never moved it. A shawl lay folded on its back, a muted blue gone to gray with age. He thought sometimes of putting it away, but each time his hand reached for it, something inside him recoiled. Like a horse smelling fire, he ate in silence, bread hard as bone, a strip of venison jerky. When the wind shouldered the walls, the lantern swayed on its hook, shadows leaning long and thin across the floorboards. It was near dusk when the knock came, soft, unsure, not the way men knock when they want something taken by force. He stood listening, heart ticking like a pocket. Watch, then opened the door. Snow swirled in like ghosts. She stood there, small against the storm, a shape wrapped in a worn coat, shawl drawn tight around her throat. The wind had carved her cheeks raw, and her braid was stiff with frost. Eyes wide, dark and alive with something beyond weariness, something like pleading. "Sir," she said, voice catching on the cold. I need a place just for tonight." Elias's grip tightened on the doorframe. Strangers were trouble more often than not, and women traveling alone, he had lived long enough to know what roads carved that kind of hunger into a face. He looked past her, but there was nothing out there, just the white world and the hiss of snow. "You got folk nearby?" he asked. Her lips parted, closed, a shake of the head. No, he felt the weight of years between his ribs, heavy as a sodden coat. It would be simpler to turn her away. That was the voice of his pride speaking, the same voice that had kept him alone through 8 winters, sitting with ghosts instead of men. But another voice stirred, softer, from some buried place, a voice he had not heard since she died. "Don't. Harden, Eli, not more than life already has." He stepped aside. "Get in before you freeze." She slipped past him, bringing the night with her, the smell of cold, the sting of it, snowflakes glittering like sparks on the plank floor. Elias shut the door, dropped the bar in place, and stood a moment with his back to it, listening to. The wind beat its fists on the walls. He gestured to the fire. "Sit, warm yourself." She moved to the hearth like a bird to cover, crouched low, hands spread over the orange glow. Her coat steamed faintly, shedding flakes that melted as they fell. Elias watched her from the table, the way her shoulders curled inward, guarding something deep. She said nothing more. Neither did he when at last she turned. Her face looked different in the lamplight, still young, though worn by some hard traveling. He saw the rawness of her hands, the fray in her shawl, the threadbare places that told of miles walked without mercy. "Thank you," she said. Barely above the fire's whisper, Elias nodded, poured her coffee from the blackened pot, the same he'd used 1,000 times and never thought to replace. She took it with both hands, drank like a soul that had come a long way for water. They ate in silence, him with the quiet rhythm of habit, her with the sharp, trembling hunger of someone who hadn't tasted warmth in days. Outside, the storm built its empire of white, sifting against the windows until the world beyond was gone. Inside, 2 shadows leaned across the walls, his, tall and gaunt, hers, small but unbroken. When the plates were cleared, he settled by the fire, elbows on his knees, staring into the coals. She sat opposite, chin tucked, the shawl drawn close. The only sound was the wind, and the pop of sap in the logs. Elias felt the strangeness of it, the sound of another breathing in his house, the murmur of cloth against wood, the living weight of presence, where for so long there had been nothing but echoes. It filled the air like the scent of rain after drought. He thought of words, any words, but his tongue stayed heavy. Better silence than something clumsy. Still, in the quiet, He felt it keenly. How far from the world he had drifted. How deep. Into the country of loneliness he had gone. And now, here was this stranger at his fire, a flicker of warmth he had not asked for, had not wanted, yet already could not ignore. He leaned back, gaze fixed on the flames, and told himself it was only for the night. But the ache in his chest told him otherwise. Morning came pale and brittle, light spilling across the plains like watered milk. Frost glazed the windows in white feathers, and the wind had gone down to a whisper, leaving behind a silence that felt hollow and deep as a well. Clara woke before Elias, her body stiff from sleep on the rough-hewn bench by the hearth. For a long moment she stayed still, listening to the creak of the timbers and the slow rhythm of a man breathing in the other room. She rose quietly, pulling her shawl tighter, and moved through the cabin on bare feet. The place was neat but worn. Every object heavy with years, the rocking chair turned toward the fire, its curved runners polished to a dull shine. A faded shawl folded on its back, the color nearly bled from it like old ink. A rifle hanging on? Pegs, oiled and gleaming though it bore the look of something kept. Ready more from duty than desire, her fingers brushed the edge of the shawl and stilled there. There was a woman in these walls, or what remained of her like perfume long gone, leaving only the memory of sweetness. Clara pulled her hand back quickly, as if touching what wasn't hers had burned. The door hinges complained low when Elias came out from his room. He moved slow, his shoulders stooped in a way that told of years with no one to straighten for. He grunted a greeting, poured water into a blackened kettle, and set it over the fire. Clara noticed he never glanced at the chair with the folded shawl. They ate in near silence, save for the scrape of knives and the wind brushing against the eaves. When Clara thanked him, his nod was brief, his eyes on the steam lifting from his cup. Later, while the sun hung weak in a sky the color of tin, they worked. Elias went out to split wood, and Clara drew water from the creek, the rope stiff with ice. Chores passed between them like cards in a game where neither dared show a full hand. By midday, with snow clouds gathering low and heavy, words began to slip out thin at first like the thread of smoke from the chimney. "You come far?" Elias asked, his axe biting deep into a round of pine. "A ways," she said, voice quiet as the falling ash. "Kin waiting?" "No." Her hands closed on the bucket's handle, knuckles whitening. Then softer, "I left a man. He wasn't kind." Elias lifted another log, his jaw working. "That's so." She said no more, and he didn't press. But he felt her words curl in the air, carrying a weight he knew too well, the kind that leaves a person walking west because east has nothing left to give. Inside, dusk crept early. Clouds shouldered the sky, dimming the light to a tarnished silver. Clara sat near the hearth with a small bundle of sewing things drawn from her bag. Elias had torn his shirt on a nail the week before, and she had asked to mend it. He agreed, though something in him resisted the sight of her there, bent over cloth in the glow of the fire, the picture too close to a life he had buried. He pretended to busy himself with the harness by the door, but his eyes kept sliding to her hands. The way the needle flashed between her fingers, quick and sure despite the rawness of her skin. There were scars there, small and pale, circling her wrists like faded rings. He wondered what had put them there, then told himself it was none of his affair. The wind began to speak again, a low hum at the edges of the world. Elias went to the window, saw the gray sky sagging like wet canvas, and knew what was coming. "Storm'll be on us by night," he said. Clara didn't look up. "I've weathered worse." He watched her a moment longer, the line of her head bowed in the firelight, her braids slipping forward across her shoulder like a dark rope. And something inside him shifted, slow, uncertain, the way ice groans before it cracks. When the last of the daylight bled out and the first flakes began to whisper against the panes, Elias set another log on the fire and sat opposite her. Neither spoke. The fire popped, throwing sparks like tiny stars between them, and the silence was no longer empty but heavy with the shape of things unsaid. It was then he understood how long it had been since he had heard another voice in the night, since the warmth of presence had leaned across the dark like this. It filled him and hollowed him all at once like breath drawn deep after years of breathing shallow dot, and in Clara's quiet, bent over her stitching, he saw it mirrored, not trust, not yet, but something softer stirring, fragile as the snow that now fell thick beyond the walls. The storm came hard and sudden, a white fury rolling out of the north. By late afternoon the sky sagged low and mean, and the wind rose with a voice like a beast roused from sleep. Snow scoured the plains in wild spirals, swallowing the last lines of fence and the narrow trace of the trail. Elias barred the door against it and felt the wood tremble under the gale's long fists. Lantern light wavered in the draught, painting the walls in gold and shadow. The cabin creaked as if remembering every year it had stood its ground, and the fire spat sparks in protest. Elias set the rifle across his knees, not for her. Never for her, but for the things that came hunting when the land lay blind with storm. Wolves smelled hunger on the wind. Men too. Clara sat near the hearth, her knees drawn up, shawl tight about her shoulders. The lamplight brushed her hair, picking copper threads from the dark. For a long time, the only voices were the wind clawing at the shutters and the logs cracking in the grate. But words like thaw water have a way of finding their course when the silence runs too deep. It's a hard land. Elias said finally, eyes on the flames. Clara gave a breath that might have been a laugh, though there was no mirth in it. Hard's all I've known. He glanced at her, waiting, and she went on in that flat, quiet way of someone who's carried a burden too far to lay it down with fuss. Left St. Louis 6 weeks back. Rode with a freighter wagon for a spell until the driver thought my company was part of his pay. Her mouth tightened. Walked after that. Some nights under sleet, some with men who weren't kind, but I kept walking. There was steel in her voice, cold and bright. Elias felt it, the grit it took to stand here at all, yet he heard the ragged edge to the cost of every mile. You aiming for someplace? He asked. Anywhere that ain't behind me. Her eyes met his then, steady as a line drawn in dirt. I won't crawl back. Not for a roof, not for bread, not for nothing. The wind howled down the chimney like laughter gone mad. Elias fed another log to the fire, slow, deliberate, as if the act itself could anchor the world. He thought of the shawl on the rocking chair, of a voice now 8 years gone, and felt the old ache stir a hollow so deep it seemed the storm might pour through it. Clara's words thinned out after that, and for a while there was only the gale and the hiss of snow flung against the glass. Elias watched her from the corner of his eye, the way she sat so still, yet every line of her held taut like a wire strung too tight. When the wind struck hard enough to rattle the panes, she flinched, then rose and crossed to the window. Her hand touched the frosted glass, fingers splayed as if to feel the wild pulse beyond. The lamplight caught her braid where it had slipped loose from the shawl, a single dark rope swinging slow, pendulum-like, back and forth. Something about it fixed in Elias's mind, a small defiance against the storm, a sign of life refusing to break. He rose too, set the rifle by the door, and moved to check the shutter latch. His shoulder brushed hers as he passed, and she drew in a breath quick, not fearful, more like a bird startled in its sleep. It'll hold? He said, voice low. Her eyes lifted to his, wide in the half-light, and for a breath they stood like that two figures caught in a world of white and wind, the silence between them warm and fragile as a candle flame. Elias turned away first, stoking the fire till it leapt high, throwing the room in amber glow. He felt something in his chest, then a stirring he hadn't let near him in years. Not desire, not yet. Something older, quieter. The plain word for it was duty, but it ran deeper than that. A need to keep the dark from swallowing what was left of the good. A need to keep her safe. Night thickened around the cabin, the kind of black that swallows the edges of things. Outside, the storm roared its endless song. Inside, they kept to opposite chairs, the heat of the fire between them. The hush of thoughts they did not share winding tight as wire. Elias sat long into the dark, the rifle within reach, listening to the storm batter the world, and knew with a bone-deep certainty he was no longer alone in this fight against the dark. The storm did not let go the next day, nor the one after. Snow banked high against the walls, swallowing the lower logs until the cabin crouched like a beast half buried in white. Wind keened through the cracks and set the shutters trembling. The fire burned low and constant, chewing through the woodpile faster than Elias liked. The hours stretched thin, long threads pulled through a needle's eye. They moved around each other in a silence that was neither easy nor hostile, just waited, as though every word cost more than they could pay. When they spoke, it was of small things, the grain left in the bin, the storm's temper, the lean look of the sky. But beneath those scraps of talk ran something else. A current felt more than heard. Elias felt it most when her eyes touched him, quiet, steady, asking without asking. He tried not to look back, tried to keep his hands busy with harness mending or shaping kindling, but still the questions pressed at him. Was this hunger in him a sin against the woman he had buried? Or was it some stubborn spark of life refusing to die in the ash of all that had burned? That evening, while he whittled by the hearth, Clara rose from her place on the floor and crossed to the chair in the corner. She reached out, slow and careful, and lifted the faded wedding shawl that lay folded there. Its threads had thinned with years, but the pattern of roses still wandered its length like ghosted vines. Was it hers? She asked softly, Elias's knife stilled. He could not bring himself to look at her, only nodded once. She held the shawl a moment longer, then laid it back as if setting down a burden not hers to bear. When darkness came full, Elias doused the lantern, leaving only the fire to paint the room in restless gold. Clara slept near it, curled tight beneath her worn coat, her braid trailing across the floor like a dark ribbon. Elias lay on his bed in the narrow side room, staring at the rafters. Sleep came hard, and when it did, it brought her the one whose shawl lay folded in the chair. She stood in snow that stretched forever, calling his name in a voice the wind shredded. He tried to go to her, but the white closed in, blind and cold. And then he woke with a jerk, the weight of vows heavy as iron on his chest. The fires. Glow reached through the open doorway, and he saw Clara there by the hearth, small and still, her breath soft against the hush. Something broke open in him then, a pain, but not the old one. This was sharp and new, a cut that bled warmth instead of cold. He swung his legs from the bed, restless, and went to check the door, more for the doing than the need. But when he stepped out at first light, the need became clear. The wind had dropped, leaving the world hushed under drifts. Smoke rose thin from the chimney into a sky rinsed clean and hard blue, and in that clean whiteness, near the corral he saw them, tracks. Hoofprints pressed sharp into the crusted snow, circling wide, then vanishing toward the timber. Not elk, not stray stock. Horses and ridden hard. Elias stood a long moment, the cold biting his cheeks, the stillness ringing in his ears. Men had been close too close, and men who rode this country in winter, skulking in storms, were not the sort to ask kindly for what they wanted. He turned back to the cabin, every sense sharpened. There, in the doorway's shadow, Clara watched him, her shawl clutched tight. He saw the question in her eyes, and with it, the trust she hadn't spoken but had given all the same. That trust hit him like a blow and a benediction in one. Whatever stirred in him, whatever name it bore, it was not a sin. It was life clawing its way back through frost and stone. And life, once given, must be guarded at all costs. The night froze hard, the kind of cold that snaps branches and steals the breath from a man's throat. Moonlight spread like steel across the drifts, and the wind had gone quiet, as though the land itself were holding still. Inside, the fire hissed and cracked, throwing restless shadows against the log walls. Elias sat near it, the rifle leaning within easy reach, every nerve wound tight. He'd felt it since sundown, a prickle along the spine, the old sense that trouble was moving closer on silent hooves. Clara must have felt it too. She hadn't spoken much, only sat with her shawl drawn close, her eyes flicking toward the door whenever the wind stirred the latch. The knock came sudden, loud as a shot in the stillness. 3 raps, then a voice drawled and mean. "Evenin', friend. Storms had us by the throat. Thought we might step in, warm ourselves some." Elias rose slow, the rifle in his hand before the last word died. He glanced at Clara. Her face had gone pale, but her chin was set. "Go to the loft," he said, low and steady. When she hesitated, his eyes held hers. "Now," the ladder creaked under her weight, then silence, save for the quick beat of his heart. Elias slid the bar from the door but left it closed. "You men best keep to your horses," he called. "Ain't no welcome here tonight," a laugh answered him, sharp as a broken spur. "We ain't a skin welcome. Just a fire and what scraps you got. Times is lean, old man." Elias drew a breath, felt the years of solitude settle on him like armor. "Then lean past me and you'll get the kind of welcome you won't stomach." The door shuddered under. A shove, then another. He stepped back, rifle raised, the barrel steady, though his blood hammered. A curse tore the night, boots scuffing on the porch, and then the plank splintered inward, the cold rushing through like a ghost. The first man came fast a shape hulking in the lantern light, and Elias fired before thought could catch him. The crack split the dark, and the man pitched forward, a ragged grunt torn from him. Snow and blood spattered the floorboards. "God damn you!" Another voice roared, and a muzzle flared outside, the shot whining past Elias's ear. He dropped to one knee, worked the lever, and fired again into the glow of their breath beyond the threshold. A curse, the sound of retreating boots. Then hoofbeats, hard and fading, swallowed by the white silence. Elias stayed crouched, lungs burning, until the night lay still as bone. Then he shut the door, slid the bar home, and leaned his back against the wood. His hands trembled, not from fear, not exactly, from the weight of what living costs. When he turned, Clara was there, coming down the ladder like a shadow drawn by the fire. Her eyes swept the room, fixed on the body sprawled across the boards, then lifted to him, not fear, not even shock. Something fiercer, sharper, like the glint of a blade in moonlight. "You're hurt," she said, her voice low but steady. He looked down, saw the tear in his sleeve, the warm trickle down his arm. "Just a scrape." She was beside him then, her hands sure as she pulled a strip from her hem and pressed it to the wound. He watched her face, the calm in it, the strength stitched deep beneath the softness. The fire threw gold through the loose strands of her hair, turned the shadow of her braid into a dark river trailing down her back. For a long moment the world shrank to the circle of her hands, the heat of the hearth, the thud of his heart against the quiet. Outside, the snow lay white and pure, hiding the black stains that marked what had been. Inside, breath mingled with breath, and something unnamed flared between them, a thing born not of want but of survival, fierce and unyielding as fire in winter. Elias sat heavy in the chair, rifle across his knees, and knew the truth that had been circling him for days. Life was not done with him yet, and neither, God help him, was she. The world lay white and still at first light, the storm spent and gone, leaving silence deep enough to hear the groan of the frozen earth. Frost filmed the windows, soft as breath. Smoke lifted thin from the chimney, curling into a sky rinsed. Pale as bone, Elias stood in that hush with a shovel in his hands and Clara at his side. The dead man lay wrapped in burlap by the corral, the cold already stiffening his limbs. They said nothing. There were no words that mattered, not for a soul that had ridden this far only to end in the snow. Together they carried him to a patch of ground where the wind had scoured the drifts thin. Elias drove the blade into iron earth, gritting his teeth against the strain, the ache sawing up his arm. Clara knelt without being asked, clawing at the frozen crust with her bare hands until her fingers are edd. It took near 2 hours before the hole was deep enough to claim him. They lowered the shape into darkness, and Elias stood a long while with his hat in his hands, head bowed, the brim shadowing his eyes. No scripture crossed his lips, only a breath that smoked white in the cold and the thought that a man ought not to go out nameless. But the name was gone, and the wind carried what mercy it could. When it was done, they turned back to the cabin. Smoke trailed soft against the pale sky, and the door wore a fringe of frost where blood had spattered hours before. Inside, the fire whispered low, and the room smelled of coffee and gun oil. Clara packed her shawl close and stood by the table, her gaze dropping to the worn floorboards. I should be going, she said, and her voice was steady though her hands twisted in the fringe. Road's long yet, and the thaw will come soon enough. Elias nodded once, heavy, and crossed to the peg where his coat hung. He pulled it on slow, each button like a weight, and stepped out to the lean-to. Her Mari was there, breath smoking, saddle hung ready. He set to the task with a care that felt like penance, every tug on the cinch a thing he'd rather not do. When he turned, she was standing in the yard, shawl tight against the wind, her braid dark against the white. Her eyes met his then, and something shifted quiet as thaw water beneath ice. She held out her hand, meaning farewell. He took it, and for a long moment neither let go. The rough of his palm against hers, the pulse beating slow and sure between there. Was more said in that silence than words could shape. You could stay, he said at last, voice low as the wind in the pines. Not as pity, not for debt, but if you'd have it so. Her breath caught, he saw it in the tremor of her lips, the way her eyes broke toward the cabin, its smoke rising soft against the sky like a promise. She stood there a span, the stillness, stretching thin until she looked back at him. I've no call to leave, she said, the words quiet as first snow. And then, slower, if you've a mind for company. He felt something ease inside him then, something wound tight through. Years of silence and sorrow. His hand closed over hers, not hard, just enough, and for the first time in a long while, the weight he carried did not feel like stone. That evening, the hearth burned bright, chasing the gray from the corners. 2 cups steamed on the table, their breath curling in the amber glow. Elias sat in his old chair, its rock-soft and slow, while Clara moved about the room with a quiet that was not loneliness but peace. Outside, the land lay white and endless under the dying sun. Inside, warmth bloomed, a fragile, stubborn thing, like green daring the snow to stay. And in that hush between the tick of the clock and the whisper of the fire, Elias understood what he had not dared hope. Even the oldest winters yield if a man will open the door when the knock comes.